who gave their renditions of what happened, and that is what I'm going to do, a little bit of that in this video for you. Holodomor is a word that comes from two Ukrainian words. One is holod means starvation or famine, and the second one, morete, means to torturously put to death. The definition is death inflicted by starvation, and it's a man-made famine. Created by the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian genocide, known as the Holodomor, it started in 1928, and it came to a crisis in 1932-33. It was about 4 million men, women, and children died because of starvation, because of man-made famine, the Holodomor. Stalin, he was a dictator who came to power, and he decided that he was going to make the Soviet Union into a very important state. And he wanted to build a very strong army because he was interested in spreading communism around the world. The Ukraine was conquered by the Soviet Red Army, and the Ukrainians who had tried to set up their own country for a while were now under what we call the Soviet Empire. The Soviet Union tried to control the Ukrainian population, which was not keen on communism. They also felt that they had to take over this land and the property of all these farmers. Now, it's not buying them out, it's a question of taking it. They had to take the grain away from the Ukrainian people and to ship kulak. A kulak is a rich peasant, as they called him. Stalin's policy at the very beginning was to arrest these farmers. They sent in a group of people from the secret police, which was called the GPU. They took him to prison. They just came and just took him forcibly, and he was put into the gulag. He died in 1937 in prison. My grandmother, who was still living in the house, the family home in the village, a group of people, again, from the GPU and maybe some locals, came in, and they threw her out of the house with just what she had on, 20 below, in January, and with her 5 children, because my father was not there at that time. They threw them out on the street, and they warned anybody who would help them that they would get the same kind of treatment. So some neighbor in the area did allow them to live in her barn for the winter. A little bit of everything they owned, the implements, the machinery, the livestock, their household items, their clothing, everything was going to be auctioned and given away. So they were just thrown out. They were garbage, basically, the scum of the earth. It was being done on a massive scale. There were about 1.5 million people, men, women, and children, who were affected. Most of them ended up in Siberia, some were executed, and some went to the gulag. And my father, in 1930, was arrested as the son of a gulag. The gulag is a Soviet concentration camp, so they were the first ones to suffer. One of the things Stalin did was he brought in something called collectivization, which means that all private property that existed would now become state property owned by the government. And that meant that you had to dispossess or take away the farmers' land and everything they owned and make them into employees of the state and work on what is called a collective farm, a kolhoz, instead of having their own farms. For the Ukrainians, this was a complete disaster. The collective farm had to meet a grain quota. In other words, they had to produce so many bushels of wheat. Well, the quotas were so high that none of the collective farms could meet them. And because they didn't believe that there wasn't enough grain, or they felt the Ukrainian farmers had kept grain for themselves to feed themselves in the winter, they started going from household to household with these big steel rods, digging in the ground, looking for things, for grain. And if they found some, the farmer was arrested immediately, shot on the spot, or sent to the gulag. If a collective farm did not produce enough grain, they were labeled as being resistors. So they were blacklisted, and 1/3 of all the villages of Ukraine were blacklisted, which meant you got no supplies and you could not go anywhere to get any food. So that you were virtually surrounded by troops and you were left to die. Most of the people, when they were thrown out of their homes, if they had relatives somewhere else, they would go and try to live with them. Some of them tried to go to the cities. The Soviets passed a law that you had to have a passport to travel. You could not leave your village. And to buy a train ticket, you had to have a passport. This was like an internal passport that you have. And so you couldn't get onto a train. So what happened is sometimes families who knew that they couldn't fend for their children, where the children are thrown onto a railway cart, where kids are thrown hoping that somebody will find these kids and feed them. So the kids became orphans, running around the cities looking for food. People who did end up in the cities were begging on the streets, and they were usually arrested and sent back to where they came from or anywhere outside the cities. In 1933, there were bodies all over the streets in the cities as well. And the people in the cities found it difficult to help because they themselves were on rations for food. There were lots of people starving and dying. There was even cannibalism, as you can well imagine. It takes about, they say, between 3 to 4 months for a person to die of starvation. So that's a very torturous death. It's a horrendous way to die. It's easier to be killed with a bullet. My mother's family lived in a small city in Ukraine. They also had a distillery in the city. A distillery requires grain to make alcohol. For this distillery, they had enough grain. My grandmother, she said there were mounds and mounds of grain, guys with guns standing around to make sure that none of the hungry people could get to this grain. She said that at the end of the fermentation process, when there was the leftovers, the chaff from the grain, was thrown into a huge, huge pit. And she said people lined the outlines of this pit. She says some of them fell into it and drowned. She would walk to that pit. She would fill the pit with the garbage that was there. She would bring it home. She would wash it. She would grind it. She would dry it. And she would make some kind of bread out of that. That's one of the reasons why they survived. The world was basically silent. The journalists were stationed in Moscow, which is quite a distance away. They were not supposed to be traveling. They were told not to leave. But some of them did dare to do it. And some of them went through Ukraine. And they saw with their own eyes what was happening. Others played along with the Soviet authorities. Walter Duranty, for example, of the New York Times, who basically said that there really is no famine. There is malnutrition, and there is some people are hungry, but it's not a starvation. He said that for the New York Times, and he won the Pulitzer Prize. But there were others who did dare. Malcolm Muggeridge was one, from the Manchester Guardian, a Brit. And there was a Canadian, HREC, who was a Canadian journalist. She was Jewish. She went on a car tour with another American, and they saw these things and they wrote about them. But very few people wanted to do anything. What are you going to do about it? It's an internal problem of the Soviet Union. Canada was the first Western country to acknowledge the Holodomor as a genocide. It's important for students to see that there is a process in how a genocide is conducted. It starts off with your first thing like bullying against one individual, one little group. It escalates to a larger group. Eventually the government gets involved. And if you have the government involved in doing that and dehumanizing a segment of the population, you'll find that it becomes a complete catastrophe, and that's how things happen. And it can happen to you if you sit and do nothing about it. Heroism means that you take a stand, even when nobody else is willing to support you, but you decide that you're going to do the right thing. And so someone like HREC, who had views at one point that were quite different, saw the reality of what was happening in Soviet Ukraine, and decided to write about it and to tell the world that this is not what they believed it was. That was all propaganda. And the same thing with the farmer, with the farmer who actually let my grandmother in with her small brood of children into his barn so that they could survive for the winter, and probably fed them to some extent with whatever meager supplies they had, that decided that this woman has done nothing to get this kind of treatment, and she's a human being. She needs to be helped. We see changes in the world. We see changes in what's happening in Europe. We see changes even in the United States. And we know that things can happen overnight. A political system can change, a person can change, and even the democracy that we have can be in danger. We have to speak out. We can't be quiet bystanders. Overnight, we can lose what we have. Now you've seen, you've become familiar with some of the history of my family. And these are some of the sources of information that we had before the Soviet Union fell apart. Everything that all their documents and archives had been hidden from scholars in the West. They couldn't get their hands on a lot of information. And so there was a lot of information about the Holodomor was actually taken from survivor accounts. And if you get enough of them, you can actually build an account. You can build a story, a narrative about what transpired. Okay, next. Could you go to the next slide, please? I wanted to share with you probably the most famous monument that exists. It's called Bitter Memories of Childhood. It's a young girl with braids, which is very Ukrainian, holding a few stalks of wheat. This monument of the Holodomor was opened in 2018 in Toronto at the exhibition grounds. The original monument is in Kyiv at the National Museum of the Holodomor Genocide. Copies of it have also been erected in 2 other Canadian cities. And we have a museum in Canada, in Winnipeg, called the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, where the Holodomor is featured. And there stands another one of these as well. Now, the monument is quite symbolic. So consider, why did they select a child for the monument? First of all, 31% of those who were starved to death within a 7-month period in 1932 to 1933 were children under the age of 10. The deaths of these children were caused by the withholding of food, not by the lack of food. So the distribution of food. And the death toll, as I've mentioned already, for the 7 months was at least 4 million, according to demographers. Now take a look at the child. It's an emaciated child. You can see there's skin and bones underneath her clothing, who seems to be looking for food to survive. Look at her eyes, and what do you see? Despair and extreme hunger. The loss of her innocence and the loss of her childhood. And what is she holding? 5 stalks of wheat. This is very symbolic. The law of the 5 stalks of wheat was set up by the Soviet Communist government that stated anyone gleaning, that means picking any stalks of grain from communist fields, government fields, could be shot immediately or imprisoned for 10 years, even a child. Next. Next, Olena. Thank you. One of the things I wanted to mention, and this is what you're doing today, is you're having a commemoration of the Holodomor. We have Holodomor Memorial Day, which worldwide is on the 4th Saturday in November. as you have been commemorating for many years already. We also have the fourth Friday in November in schools across Canada. We got this in 2008, and we commemorate the Holodomor to remember those who were starved to death and the survivors. And again, the usual thing is to light a candle. In schools, it's difficult unless you get some kind of electrical candles because of a fire hazard. But usually there's other activities as well that are held on a special day like that. And this year, it's on the 26th on a Friday. And I'm sure you're going to be doing things with your schools as well. This year marks 88 years since the Holodomor. And yet, it is still little known worldwide or acknowledged. As was said before, Canada was the first Western country that recognized the Holodomor as genocide in 2008. And now Holodomor Memorial Day is acknowledged in many school districts across Canada as well. We started it in Toronto, and then we continued to do that across the country. The Ukrainian community has interviewed some of the survivors of the Holodomor. For the most part, were children at that time, no older than you, who spoke of what happened to them and their families. These may be found online for the teacher's interest at the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center in Toronto. Most of them, of the survivors, have now passed. The effects of trauma, such as the Holodomor, have left serious psychological and physical after effects on survivors, and even on their children for at least 3 generations, or so we know as so far, as even the DNA of those children and the trauma remains for several generations. These interviews and those of children of survivors today help us to understand what happened in Ukraine. Next. So we've already looked at that, death inflicted by starvation, from 2 Ukrainian words. Next. Next, please. This is a map of, go back to the map of Ukraine, please. Just wanted to show you the dark areas are the areas that were affected by the Holodomor. As you can see, Western Ukraine was part of Poland at that time, and Crimea was not part of Ukraine at that time. Now, find the city of Kyiv and find the city of Kharkiv. They're in the northern area. This is the area that was the hardest hit during the Holodomor. This is the area where most of the rebellions and revolts were held against collectivization. And it's the area where they wanted their own, they were very nationalistically inclined, wanted their own country. And so Stalin made sure that this area suffered more than any other. The grain growing area is in the south, where you have Zaporizhia, where you have Mykolaiv. And so that is interesting. And also there's another dark part, the Kuban, as you can see on the map. That is an area in Russia where the Zaporozhian Cossacks settled after 1775. And it was mostly about 68% of the population was Ukrainian. They also suffered greatly during the Holodomor. Next, please. Basic facts about the Holodomor. I'm sure you probably know all this. So what it is, death inflicted by starvation, the years. I mentioned in the film that it started in 1928. That's when the first 5-year plan was brought. That's when they started arresting people. But the escalation, the actual high numbers of people dying, was a little later. The Soviet regime under dictator Joseph Stalin are the people who caused it, to this to happen. And so it happened in Soviet Ukraine, which was ruled by the Soviet Union, ruled Ukraine at that time, and the Kuban. And one thing I should mention is that at the height of the Holodomor, 28,000 people died a day in June of 1933. Now you see numbers with COVID these days, how they rise. 28,000 a day were dying because nothing was left for them to eat by that time. Next, please. So how was it done? By collectivizing all private farms. There were 5 million Ukrainian independent farms in the 1920s, before collectivization. The government of the Soviet Union took them over by force, everything they owned, and they created 25,000 kolhosps, or collective farms, that were run by the government. And these successful farmers and the farmers who had owned their own land became simply employees of the state. But before they did that, they decided that they were going to destroy the successful farmers and leaders in the villages who would not be able to organize the rest of the Ukrainian farmers to revolt. So they called them kulaks in Russian and kurkuls in Ukrainian. And they did this through arrests. They arrested them, called them parasites, had terrible names for them. It's a derogatory term. They deported them and their whole families to Siberia or elsewhere and dumped them in the cold, and they executed them. And that was over 500,000 people. And the other thing that happened, there were grain quotas that in Ukraine were increased in 1 year 4 times. And none of the kolhosps were able to grow enough. So they even took the seed grain, which is used to plant for the next year. And they forcibly removed all food from most villagers in Ukraine and the Kuban. So they had people going in, they would take your bread out of your oven. They would take your onions and potatoes or whatever else you had, because you could survive on other things other than grain. But even that was taken away. Next slide, please. And that, the blacklisting you already heard, it simply means the village is surrounded by troops and nothing goes in and nothing goes out, which means people were left to starve. And 1/3 of the villages in Ukraine were affected by this. They sealed Ukraine's borders. No other part of the Soviet Union had sealed borders, but they sealed Ukrainian borders so that they could prevent the farmers from walking out and searching for food in Russia, where it was available. And they set up a system, as you already heard, of internal passports. And the only ones who didn't get them were the farmers who lived in villages. The factory workers had them, but not the farmers. And they also targeted the Ukrainian leadership, the political leaders, even the Ukrainian communists were removed from their positions. The cultural leaders, the writers and dramatists, and the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church, which was separate from the Russian Church. And they either deported these people or sent to concentration camps, or they were executed. And the main thing is that food was used as a weapon in the Holodomor. And most genocides, world genocides like the Holocaust and others like the Armenian, happened during a time of war. In this time, it was a time of peace. They were not fighting anybody else outside of the country. So this was an internal war, I guess we could say, against the villagers or the farmers. Next, please. So why was this done? The communist government wanted to forcibly collectivize all private farms to use and get the grain to sell for money so that they could buy machinery for their factories. Remember that Stalin wanted to industrialize, to create a very powerful state. He felt everyone was going to attack him because they were bringing in communism. So you had to have a powerful army. So you needed guns, you needed tanks, you needed all kinds of things. So that's what it was. But you had to pay for these machines. They bought them from Canada, they bought them from the United States, from Great Britain. And that's what he used the money for. And also to provide food for the Russian cities. The other thing was, Stalin did not appreciate the Ukrainian nationalist feelings and their identity. He felt Ukrainians were too Ukrainian. And they wanted to create a new identity for people, a Soviet identity, where you would be loyal to the state, but you would use the Russian language and culture. So this was another thing. And where did the traditions and most of the people who spoke Ukrainian live? They lived in the villages and they were farmers. And so Stalin really feared losing Ukraine due to the revolts and resistance to communism that he experienced and the desire for Ukrainian independence. In 1930 alone, there were 1,000 incidents of revolts against collectivization. There was even a time when a large number of women came out from a kolkhoz, refusing to work, not going into work, coming out with pitchforks against guns. Next, please. And I did mention that Ukrainians were interested in independence, and he feared that Ukraine will try to separate and become an independent state. So this is a famous quotation that I like to use. The terror famine of 1932-33 was a dual purpose byproduct of collectivization. In other words, it had two purposes, two reasons. Designed to suppress Ukrainian nationalism, that is Ukrainian identity and their wanting to have their own country, and the most important concentration of prosperous peasants or farmers at one throat. Next. So what are the consequences of the Holodomor? First of all, we have a great population loss. As we mentioned, 31% of the victims were children under the age of 10. The numbers range anywhere from different people from 2.6 million to the latest was 10.5 million. They are now trying to figure that out in Ukraine. Apparently, President Zelensky has set up a special commission to check out the different methods of calculating the deaths. And don't forget, this is the additional deaths. There is a calculation of how many people normally die in a year, but you also have to take a look at this is above the normal rate that they're talking about. And the one that the demographers come out with is 4 million. Also, a policy of Russification was brought in. Now you can see from the word itself, it means making things more Russian, which means that to bring in the Russian language into schools, to bring in Russian culture, and making it a priority in Ukraine as well. And denationalizing means taking away your national identity, was enforced in Ukraine. Just to give you an idea, teachers in Ukraine who taught in Ukrainian schools, because there were Ukrainian schools still, even with Russification, so parents had a choice where they could send their kids. A teacher who taught in Russian, in a Russian school, would get a higher salary than one who taught Ukrainian in a Ukrainian school. So you can imagine that kind of policy being there as well. Now, I want to also mention the loss of historical memory, very important. No one could speak about the genocide, Ukrainian genocide, for generations. People who lived through it were forbidden to talk about it to their kids, to their grandchildren, because for fear that these children would come to school, and if the teacher said anything, they would argue with the teacher, and then the whole family would be arrested. So this was something that was very serious. And so there were generations of kids who grew up not knowing that their grandfather or grandmother survived or didn't survive. There were other relatives who died as a result of the Holodomor. I went to Ukraine for 15 years teaching teachers how to teach history. I wrote a book about it so that they would teach in a different way. And I brought with me the first documentary film on the Holodomor called Harvest of Despair, Żniwa rozpaczu in Ukrainian. And I remember sitting my history teachers down, and every time I showed the film, there were tears. Most of them were appalled that they had never heard of this. This is in different parts of Ukraine, from Lviv to Karpaty, down to Kharkiv, Odessa, and so forth. And so that kind of history was destroyed. Elimination of Ukrainian leadership, I've already mentioned that. And today, Ukraine is a post-genocidal society. What does that mean? Trauma. People have lived with trauma. For 5 decades, that means, different generations grew up without knowing about their history. And it's not just about Holodomor. It was also about Kievska Rus. If you think about Mr. Putin, he still claims that Kiev is the center of Russian culture. So that the history was written by the conquerors. And now Ukraine is trying to bring back its history the way it should be. So they eliminated Ukrainian leadership. That meant you had a foreign element now controlling a large portion of the Ukrainian society during Soviet times. And a colonial country, what does that mean, to be a colony? Well, the Americans know about that quite well. You had the American Revolution to get away from Britain and set up yourself as your own state. Obviously, the mother country expects lots of things from you. So Ukraine was a place to get minerals, to get agricultural products, and of course, Ukraine was always the breadbasket of Europe, and they used to be able to make lots of money on selling the grain. But in the past, they didn't try to force the Ukrainians to die in those numbers. But during the Holodomor, it was an intentional thing that happened. And today, of course, we still see that the Ukrainians and Ukraine is still a prime target for Russian expansion. Mr. Putin has annexed Crimea and claims it's his and won't give it back. And he's invaded parts of the Donbass in 2014. So we know that the issue about Ukraine being outside of Russian control is still a very big point for him. And he doesn't even want to acknowledge the fact that Ukrainians are a separate nation and not Russians. Next, please. This is one of my favorite quotations by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, a number of years ago, because I think it gives us a very good idea of what a genocide means. A genocide begins with the killing of one man, not for what he has done, but because of who he is. Now, what does this mean? Think about it. It's identity. And how are we identified? By the language we speak, by the color of our skin or our hair or our eyes, by our religious connotation. And so basically, if you kill a person for who he is, that is a sign of genocide. Okay, next. So I wanted to bring your attention to something that I think all of us need to know. I'm sure you study this in school, but I wanted for you to think about this. We have the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and Article 1 states, all human beings are created equal in dignity and rights. Think about that. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. It is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So, did we see that in the Soviet Union? No. Do we see that in our society? We should. But we know that even we have difficulties with making sure that this is right, being tolerant towards one another, not putting people down because they are different from you and making them be others. Next, please. So I wanted to mention to you something that I consider to be important, and I've set up this little scheme. The stages of human rights abuses. So we've mentioned already that it starts with bullying, maybe against you. I'm sure this is happening in schools. We have strict rules against it in our schools in Canada, but I'm sure it happens in the playgrounds and so forth. But bullying is identifying a person by something you don't like about them. And if more than one person is picked out, then eventually a larger group is picked out. And then it could be that this larger group starts discriminating against others. So that's the second stage. Discrimination, you don't allow them to play with you. You don't allow them to become part of your friends or your group and so forth. And then dehumanizing, making statements about them that makes them be less than human. They did this with the Kuryliws, the kulaks Kuryliws. They tried to say that they were like rats, parasites. They made huge posters with all kinds of ugliness around kulaks, so that the general population would take a look at them and say, well, these are the people who are the scum of the earth. If they kill them, it doesn't matter. But it does matter. So dehumanization is another aspect of bringing about genocide. And it's when the government gets involved in the dehumanization process, as it did in the Soviet Union against Ukrainians and the kulaks, then it becomes a complete catastrophe. Because then you lead to persecution. And that means you can arrest people, you can do whatever you want. And of course, there were no human rights in the Soviet Union at that time. It was a totalitarian state. And so it leads to genocide, the extreme form of human rights abuse. Next. And this is Raphael Lemkin. He is the father of the term genocide. He was a lawyer of Jewish background who lived in Poland, and he lived in Lviv as well. And he lived there in the 1930s when some lucky people were able to swim across the Zbruch River and survive and come to Western Ukraine. So he met and he heard about the Ukrainian genocide, and he studied it as well. And in 1953, for the 30th anniversary in New York, he was asked to give the keynote speech at the event. And this is what he said, one of the things he said. What I want to speak about is perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest and broadest experiment in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. And this is something that is on our website. You can read the whole speech. It's also in my book. So it's something that you can take a look, because it even has stages as to what kind of people had to be destroyed, how they destroyed, the Soviets did that. So this is another painting that is quite famous. It's actually in Bombruk, in the Orthodox cemetery. There's a museum there, and it's a museum with Holodomor monuments in it, and photographs and documents. But what I wanted to bring your attention to is that the Holodomor has been denied, covered up, and ignored for over 5 decades after it occurred. Who was it denied by? It was denied by the Soviet Union, and today it is still denied. Could you go back a minute? Could you go back? It is still being denied by Putin and his government. Covered up, it was covered up by journalists like Duranty that we mentioned already, and ignored by Western governments. During the 1930s, when the Holodomor was at its height, the United States recognized the Soviet Union as a legitimate country because they were selling machinery to them. And the same thing happened in other countries as well. So this is the kind of thing that went on. All right, next, please. Another monument. This is considered, some people have told me that this is the first Holodomor monument in the world. I'm not 100% sure, but it probably is. It was built and set up in 1983 for the 50th anniversary of the Holodomor, and it stands in Edmonton, Alberta in Canada. And you can see each one, the hands going up and the broken circle of life being broken, sculpted by Lyudmila Timirte. Next. And this one I am sure you all know. This is the field of wheat that was set up as a monument in Washington, D.C. in 2015 and sculpted by Larissa Kuryliw. You can actually see, even in this picture, the transformation of the wheat field from a prosperous wheat field to something no longer as prosperous. again. Okay, next. And we come back to Nina and holding the candle. We have, our organization, HREC, which is the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, where I am the Director of Education, every year puts out a pamphlet. I wonder if we can now put this down so that I can show the pamphlet. Put me on. Thank you. Could you have me share with the public?
You could just show it.
Well, but they won't be able to see it very well if it's on top.
I will share with
This is a
them.
pamphlet that we produce every year for schools across Canada, and I send them out to the United States as well. And I know I saw one that Ms. Daniluk showed of some of the things that we have in here that you have copied it partially to make your own pamphlet, which is great. So this is we sent this out digitally. There's an announcement here that could be read over the PA. And there are all kinds of information, from basic facts to information on books you can have, guests you can invite, and so forth. I could send this to you if you like, and all the teachers can get this for themselves as well. So that is, in a nutshell, more or less what I wanted to say to you, to give you a brief outline of what the Holodomor was all about. The term Holodomor was not used at the very beginning. I just wanted you to know. I heard the term from my mother because they liked to, back when I was a child, but it became popular only in the 1980s, coming from those two words. And I think it makes a lot more sense because they use different terms, the Great Famine and so forth. But for our purposes, it is now being used, and it is being used widely, and it is getting better known as we go along. So I thank you for your attention. You have been a good audience, I'm sure. And I'm ready to answer any questions you may have.
If you have a questions, please ask questions, but please unmute yourself.
Were there any known black markets during the time?
Black market?
Yes.
There were, yes, they had markets. You could set up, there were government-run markets where people could sell things, and they also could, what the Ukrainians did, they would bring their precious items to these markets, hoping to sell them on the fringe of the legal market, trying to get some bread. And there's an excellent story, Mirhorodsky Yarmarok, the market in Mirhorod in the Poltava province, where an old gentleman takes his kožuch that he had, that he made and his wife had embroidered, and he goes with it because his wife is already swollen and she's dying, and he wants to come back with some bread, and he goes to the Yarmarok. And the people that are going through there, he hears a lot of Russian. He finds that they sort of are not interested in his wares and want to take it for almost nothing. And he tries to return home and dies along the way. It's a really touching story. But that kind of thing that happened. This is, as people tried to get rid of their wares. Exactly. They tried to exchange, and it was almost like a barter system where I want some bread if they could get the bread, because there was bread in special stores, and the people in the cities had rations so they could get things, but not for the villagers. So they would come and they would go to these markets. There was something else called the Turksin, which was a government set up store where you could buy products, including bread, by bringing your gold and silver. And that's what the Ukrainians did. There's a short story also called Obruchki, the rings. That was, it's a very interesting story. It'd be excellent for grade 5 or 6. About how a boy ended up with these rings of his parents, the rings of the wedding bands that they would surrender. And the Soviet Union made a lot of money from the gold that was surrendered by these unfortunate farmers who went to the Turksins to get a piece of bread or a loaf of bread to try to keep their families alive. Good question. Any other?
Чути мене, Оленка? Так? Доброго дня усім. Я є Ірина Свитка, вчителька української мови школи непорочного зачаття. Найперше я хочу подякувати нашому лектору, пані Вірі Kuryliw, за таку коротку, але дуже інформативну лекцію, подані дуже цікаві матеріали, які повинні знати наші діти. Хочу сказати, що на протязі декількох років завдяки членам нашого комітету Голодомору в Мічигані ми маємо можливість дізнаватися і вивчати про Голодомор. Потрошки, але ми це робимо. Щороку ми маємо тиждень пам'яті по Голодомору. Ми прикрашаємо, маємо спеціальний куточок, декоруємо його із колосками, із фотографіями про ті страшні події. Щодня під час цього тижня ми проводимо якусь подію, яка відбувається. В понеділок молитва, вівторок дивимося фільми, сьогодні маємо лекцію. У четвер на уроках пані Оксани Заведенко, на уроках культури, будемо виготовляти свічечки пам'яті. В п'ятницю будемо мати поминальну службу за жертвами Голодомору, а також будемо роздавати ці свічечки із нагадуванням про те, що діти, ви маєте їх запалити на останню суботу листопада, тобто 27 листопада. Також хочу подякувати пані Вірі за гарний подарунок, який ви зробили нам минулого року, за вашу книжку. З цієї книжки ми можемо навчати наших діток, особливо американців групи Ukrainian Genocidal Famine. Що я хотіла сказати ще? Я вдячна пані Олені Данилюк, яка представляє комітет Голодомору на Мічигані, за те, що вона дала можливість нам сьогодні поспілкуватися з вами, зустрітися і послухати про ті події, як то кажуть, із вуст очевидців. Бо ваша сім'я пережила цей страшний голод. Я так само обов'язково хочу подякувати дирекції нашої школи на чолі із директоркою Меріан Бруда за те, що вона організувала сьогоднішню подію для 5, 6, 7, 8 класів нашої школи. Так що ми сподіваємося на дальшу співпрацю із вами, пані Віро, так само, на наступні роки.
Я хотіла щось, якщо можна сказати. Якраз вийшла одна менша книжка моя в Україні на українській мові. Називається «Майстерня історика». І це є викладання. Чекайте, я мушу подивитися, як. На українській мові «Права людини та Голодомору». Викладання історії. Так що тут дуже великий акцент є на методику, щоб виробляти критичне мислення, історичне мислення. І все написано для вчителя, як той урок можна провадити. Так що це якраз вийшло цього літа. А я ще тільки маю одну копію. Як я дістану більше, я можу до вас, я можу вислати, одну копію, один примірник, було б добре. Друге, моя книга, ту, що ви отримали, вона в англійській мові. Але тепер вже перекладена на українську, ми тепер переходимо в редакцію, там все поправляємо, і вона буде виходити в українській мові 2022 року. Тільки, я думаю, десь навесні буде готова. Так що так само будете мати на українській мові.
Is your book written in English?
This one is going to be written in English as well as French. In Canada, we're a bilingual country, so you have to do it in French as well. This one will be printed in English and in French. Yes.
That's very good. I'm American serving in this wonderful community, and I thank you for bringing your experiences and your expertise to our school and our students. I think it's, as a history and language arts teacher, it's very important for them to learn the history, their identity, their culture as a very rich culture, and they need to keep it. So I'm grateful for our Pani Irina and Pani Oksana for bringing and keeping the culture very strong and very alive. As an American, I've grown to really respect the Ukrainian culture. And also, I really admire your presentation. You were an excellent example for presenting and articulating your thoughts, and an excellent example for the students. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. If any of you are interested, we have a website for with educational materials. It is very simple, education.holodomor.ca. Lots of lesson plans, lots of teaching materials, all the latest things, and we have lists of resources where you can look for other things as well. So that's, and we also encourage your teachers to submit lessons on the Holodomor for our HREC Educator Award for lesson plan development. We have that on our website, so please do visit, and we would welcome more lessons, especially at the elementary level. We have more people doing it at the senior level, but it would be nice to have more elementary materials.
Бажаю вам міцного здоров'я, дякуємо ще раз за лекцію. Сподіваємося на нові зустрічі в наступні роки. Всього вам найкращого.
Дуже дякую. Всього доброго всім.
Кажуть діти, що їм дуже сподобалося. От за моєю спиною. Дуже гарно. Дякую. Дякую за інформацію. Thank you so much.
Valentina, please report to grade 4. Your class is waiting for you. Valentina, please report to grade 4. Your class is waiting for you.
Thank you so much.
Дякую, пані Валентино. Ми дехто з дому мав нагоду слухати і плакати разом з вами і переживати ще раз. Чекайте, я включу своє відео. Діти вже від'єднали.
А хто це говорить?
Я включила відео, зараз буде. Це мене звати пані Оксана Заваденко. Вони згадували, я буду з дітками робити свічечки. Я ще раз хочу подякувати пані Олені за те, що вона зініціювала це все і дала змогу вам сказати до нас, і нам дала змогу почути. Дякую вам, пані Валентино, і пані Олені, і дирекції, і всім. Дякую.
Дякую.
Дякую всім. Да, бо без команди ми б не спрацювали. Так що я теж, Оксана, я вдячна і за твою допомогу, і пані Валентини, і всіх, хто долучився. Бо інакше ми б цього не зробили. Так що я вам
Ще не
дійсно.
була згадана ще одна вчителька, яка багато також робить, пані Надя Михайля.